In this video, we'll be looking at some of the weakest cards to ever achieve real success in high-level competitive Magic. Perhaps they were stronger back in the day, or well suited to a particular meta, or perhaps simply the best option from a limited card pool. Either way, it's hard to imagine them appearing in a Pro Tour or World Championship winning deck list today. Let's dive in. Number 40. Undiscovered Paradise. This land has tap, add 1 mana of any color. During your next untap step, as you untap your permanents, return this land to its owner's hand. Perfect color fixing is undeniably valuable, but that drawback is incredibly restrictive. Obviously, having to pick the land back up each turn makes it much harder to build your mana base over the course of the game. Yet even with such an obvious downside, Undiscovered Paradise has been played at high-level tournaments across multiple formats. 2 copies appeared in the standard deck that won Worlds 1998, for instance. Then, the card showed up in a Slivers extended deck that made top 8 at Worlds 1999. Many years later, Undiscovered Paradise even found a home in vintage dredge decks in the 2010s. Rather than relying on traditional spellcasting, this archetype aimed to stock its graveyard with powerful creatures before bringing them directly onto the battlefield. One of the key ones was Bloodghast, which returns from the graveyard whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control. Because Undiscovered Paradise continually returns to your hand, it can be replayed every turn to repeatedly trigger Bloodghast's landfall ability, while also helping you with your mana fixing. Nowadays, Undiscovered Paradise continues to achieve results in pre-modern leagues and challenges, usually in full English breakfast decks, though they typically only play 1 copy. Number 39. Pyromancer's Goggles. This legendary artifact costs 5 mana and has tap, add 1 red mana. When that mana is spent to cast a red instant or sorcery spell, copy that spell and you may choose new targets for the copy. While the effect is flashy, 5 mana is a huge investment for an artifact that provides no immediate impact on the battlefield, and it doesn't even function without additional spells to pair with it. As a result, the card looked like it would be relegated to kitchen tables, but it actually managed to break through in Standard, logging 67 competitive results on MTG Top 8. A Goggle ramp deck even made Top 8 at Pro Tour Shadows over Innistrad and Grand Prix Minneapolis. Typically, lists used the goggles to duplicate the spell Fall of the Titans. It's an instant costing XX and 1 red, but it has Surge, so if you or a teammate have cast another spell this turn, you may instead cast it for just X and 1 red. It says, Fall of the Titans deals X damage to each of up to 2 targets. With Pyromancer's Goggles out, Fall of the Titans suddenly represented an enormous amount of damage for a relatively modest investment. Picking off even big threats was relatively easy if the spell was being copied. The interaction became even more threatening once the game went long. With 10 or more mana available, players could pour nearly all of it into a single Fall of the Titans, copy the spell with Goggles, and send an overwhelming amount of direct damage at the opponent to finish the game on the spot. Even this year, a few Jeskai Control and 5-color decks in Standard have run Pyromancer's Goggles, now seeking to copy haymakers like Jeskai Revelation. Number 38. Tygum's Scheming. A sorcery from Khans of Tarkir, costing 1 generic and 1 blue. It says Surveil 5. While filling the graveyard is good, Tygum's Scheming crucially does not let you draw anything. Neither does the significantly superior Otherworldly Gaze, though that surveils 6 in total and half of it can be cast from the graveyard, rewarding mill strategies, and helping you increase your spell count for effects like Arclight Phoenix. Regardless, the Khan's meta was full of strong delve spells like Dig Through Time and Treasure Cruise, and Taigam's scheming helped with that game plan despite being relatively inefficient. As a result, though never a format staple, the sorcery was used in some high-level Jeskai Ascendancy combo decks. In 2015, a modern Reanimator deck that went 5-0 in a league also ran it. Number 37. Send to Sleep. Instant for 1 generic and 1 blue. Tap up to 2 target creatures. Then it also has Spell Mastery, so if there are 2 or more instant and/or sorcery cards in your graveyard, those creatures don't untap during their controller's next untap steps. This looks like a limited card. Spending a card to simply tap 2 creatures, even for more than 1 turn, is usually not a constructed viable play. Nevertheless, Send to Sleep showed up in a few standard events back in 2015 and 2016. The blue-red control deck that won Grand Prix San Diego ran 2 copies in the main board. Likewise, a Simic ramp deck playing the card made top 16 of Grand Prix Portland, an event consisting of 1,700 players. Both decks found it easy to enable Spell Mastery, and clearly Send to Sleep seemed like the best option available to them for slowing down aggro game plans. Number 36. Pilgrim's Eye. 3 mana for a 1/1 flying artifact creature. When it enters, you may search your library for a basic land card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle. To modern eyes, those stats look too fragile and the ETB effect too underwhelming, especially at 3 mana. Yet Pilgrim's Eye has logged almost 250 tournament finishes on MTG Top 8. It was first printed in Worldwake in 2010 and then reprinted in Battle for Zendikar in 2015. And it achieved results in both environments. The first time around, it showed up mostly in Birthing Pod builds and mono-white control decks. The deck that came 9th at Grand Prix Barcelona ran a full playset. Then, during its second run in Standard, Pilgrim's Eye once again performed decently. For example, an Azorius Panharmonicon deck running Pilgrim's Eye made top 8 at Grand Prix Denver, while a black-green Delirium deck playing it won the Star City Games Standard Open in Atlanta. Pilgrim's Eye worked especially well in Delirium decks because it has 2 card types. In addition, after Eldritch Moon, there was a successful standard archetype built around emerge creatures like Elder Deep Fiend. Pilgrim's Eye slotted into that strategy really well, helping you hit your land drops while also being sackable to reduce an emerge cost. A Temur Emerge deck playing Pilgrim's Eye came second at Pro Tour Eldritch Moon, while another came 4th at Worlds 2016. Number 35. Woodweaver's Puzzle Knot. This is a 2 mana artifact that grants you 3 life and 3 energy counters when it enters. You can also pay 2 generic and 1 green and sacrifice it for the same effect. The boogeyman of Kaladesh Standard was Aetherworks Marvel, a potent payoff for energy strategies. It's a 4 mana artifact that says, whenever a permanent you control is put into a graveyard, you get an energy counter. It also has tap, pay 6 energy, look at the top 6 cards of your library, you may cast a spell from among them without paying its mana cost. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. Powered by other energy creators, these decks used Aetherworks Marvel to cast absurd things like Ulamog the Ceaseless Hunger. Woodweaver's Puzzle Knot was one of the most efficient tools for helping you get there. With Marvel on the battlefield, a single Puzzle Knot could yield you a total of 7 energy, while also padding your life total. 6 of the top 16 decks at Pro Tour Amsterdam included both Aetherworks Marvel and Woodweaver's Puzzle Knot, and in total this pair of cards has logged almost 500 tournament finishes on MTG Top 8. The strategy was so dominant that Aetherworks Marvel was eventually banned from Standard. With it gone, people stopped playing Woodweaver's Puzzle Knot altogether. Number 34. Oval Chase Daredevil. 3 generic and 1 black for a 4/1 that says, whenever an artifact you control enters, you may return this card from your graveyard to your hand. This card came out in Kaladesh in 2016, but it saw almost no play in Standard. Its effect seemed too narrow. However, in 2021, in the wake of MH2, some modern players began to experiment with Oval Chase Daredevil alongside cards like Witch's Oven, the Underworld Cookbook, and the Legend Asmo. The cookbook taps to discard a card and create a food token, so you can discard Oval Chase Daredevil to it. Then when the food token enters, the Daredevil's triggered ability returns it to your hand, meaning you can repeat this process every turn. You could then sacrifice those food tokens to Asmo to kill off your opponent's creatures. Thanks to these strategies, Oval Chase Daredevil has posted over 400 tournament appearances in Modern, as well as 18 in Legacy. In Legacy, an MTGO player named Killer B has been using it in a mono-blue artifacts strategy, piloting it to a 3rd place finish in a Legacy challenge in May 2026. Number 33. Jushi Apprentice. Jushi Apprentice is a flip card from Champions of Kamigawa. It's 1 generic and 1 blue for a 1/2 with pay 2 generic and 1 blue, tap, draw a card. If you have 9 or more cards in hand, flip this creature. The Apprentice then becomes Tomoya the Revealer, a legendary 2/3 wizard with pay 3 generic and 2 blue, tap, target player draws X cards, where X is the number of cards in your hand. The problem is that racking up 9 cards in hand to flip Jushi Apprentice is a tall order, and on top of that, if you're at a point where you have 9 cards in hand, you're probably winning anyway, so it's a very win more card. Despite that, Jushi Apprentice made its mark in Standard between 2005 and 2006. Its most famous home was the deck known as Jushi Blue, a control strategy built around answering nearly everything the opponent did while slowly accumulating more resources over the course of a very long game. Rather than winning quickly, the deck focused on trading 1-for-1 with removal and counterspells until it eventually buried the opponent in card advantage. Within that strategy, the Apprentice wasn't valued because it flipped. In fact, transforming it happened relatively infrequently. The important part was simply having a reliable source of repeatable card draw. Even though each activation was expensive, control decks often found themselves passing the turn with untapped mana anyway. If the opponent cast a threatening spell, that mana became a counterspell. If they did nothing worth answering, the same mana could instead be spent drawing another card with Jushi Apprentice. Some blue-black control decks also experimented with the Apprentice, as did a green-blue strategy known as Critical Mass. In the end, the card achieved some solid results, making top 8 at various nationals around the world, before claiming 2 top 8 spots at Worlds 2005. Number 32. Jungle Weaver. This 5/6 spider costs 5 generic and 2 green. It has reach and cycling for a cost of 2. There's a massive difference between paying 2 mana for a cycling cost and paying 1, so at first glance, this card just looks like draft chaff. However, for about half a decade, it was a staple of living end decks in Modern. Back in the day, the archetype mostly just ran cascade spells and creatures with cycling, dumping them into their graveyard, digging toward a combo piece, and then reanimating them all. There weren't all that many great cycling creatures to choose from, so Jungle Weaver had a role to play. A Living End deck playing Jungle Weaver came third out of 1,600 players at Grand Prix Antwerp in 2013. The following year, the Spider showed up in a Living End deck that went undefeated on day 1 of Grand Prix Boston, an event with almost 2,400 players. Jungle Weaver posted its final Grand Prix top 8 at 2016's Grand Prix Bologna, another tournament with more than 2,000 players. Number 31. Phantasmagorian. This oddball from Planet Chaos costs 5 generic and 2 black, has power and toughness 6/6, and says, when you cast this spell, any player may discard 3 cards. If a player does, counter Phantasmagorian. It also has an ability you can activate while it's in the graveyard. Discard 3 cards, return this card from your graveyard to your hand. Played fairly, this creature is heavily overcosted. As a result, it saw 0 standard play. However, Phantasmagorian went on to have a lot of success in Eternal formats, due to the fact that it serves as an almost uncounterable 0-mana discard outlet that simply requires you to have it in your graveyard. Various graveyard strategies found ways to exploit that. In dredge decks, for example, you could keep a hand with Phantasmagorian in it, play nothing so you have a total of 8 cards in hand, discard the Phantasmagorian at end step, then activate its ability by discarding 3 cards, typically dredges that you want in your yard. Then, with that ability on the stack, you could even activate it again to discard another 3 cards, making this a very efficient way of stocking the graveyard. Likewise, in scenarios where you've milled your whole library but you've drawn certain key cards that you need in your graveyard to combo off, Phantasmagorian is a convenient way of discarding them. For all these reasons, Phantasmagorian has appeared in winning Legacy and Modern decks for years, and as recently as 2025. Number 30. Shuko. This 1-mana equipment from Betrayers of Kamigawa grants the equipped creature +1/+0, and, more importantly, it has an equip cost of 0. For years, Shuko looked completely outclassed. The obvious comparison was with Bone Splitter, another 1-mana equipment that provides +2/+0 at the cost of paying 1 mana to equip. In the early 2020s, Legacy Cephalid Breakfast decks incorporated Shuko as a way of repeatedly targeting Cephalid Illusionist to mill their own deck. The equipment really exploded though after the printing of Nadu Winged Wisdom in Modern Horizons 3. Nadu grants every creature you control an ability that triggers whenever that creature becomes the target of a spell or ability. The first 2 times this happens to each creature you control every turn, you reveal the top card of your library. Lands enter the battlefield immediately, while every other card goes into your hand. Because equipping Shuko costs nothing, you can move it from creature to creature as many times as you like. Every equip activation targets the creature, generating another Nadu trigger. With several creatures in play, Shuko becomes a free engine for drawing cards and accelerating your mana. This synergy caused demand for Shuko to skyrocket. Around the time of MH3's release, the card's price spiked from $2.80 to $37. Ultimately, the Shuko-Nadu interaction proved too busted, and the Simic legend was banned from Modern and Legacy in short order, and Shuko's price crashed back to Earth. Number 29. Tarnished Citadel. This land from Odyssey has tap, add 1 colorless, and tap, add 1 mana of any color. This land deals 3 damage to you. Although the option of adding colorless without taking damage compensates a lot, bolting yourself every time you want to make colored mana with this is rough. City of Brass, by contrast, only pings you for 1. Nevertheless, there are some situations where deck builders have wanted the Citadel. It shows up in a decent amount of commander decks and has made more than 4,000 MTG top 8 appearances in competitive EDH. Back in the day, Tarnished Citadel was also played in Extended, appearing for example in Shuhei Nakamura's 3rd place Cephalid Breakfast deck at Grand Prix Seattle 2005. Some Legacy, Dredge, and Death's Shadow lists flirted with Tarnished Citadel in the early 2010s, and nowadays it's still used in some pre-modern Tinker Fling combo decks where they don't care too much about the life loss. Number 28. Forsaken City. Forsaken City is another land that can produce mana of any color, but it comes with some brutal drawbacks. It doesn't untap during your untap step, and it also says, at the beginning of your upkeep, you may exile a card from your hand. If you do, untap this land. That actively strips you of card advantage, just in return for a bit of color fixing. Nevertheless, this proved to be an upside in the right shell. Forsaken City went on to achieve tournament success thanks to its synergy with Stasis. Stasis says, players skip their untap steps. At the beginning of your upkeep, sacrifice this enchantment unless you pay 1 blue mana. Together, Tarnished Citadel and Stasis create a lock, since you can exile a card to untap the Citadel and use mana from the Citadel to pay for Stasis's maintenance cost. Today, this combo is strong in the pre-modern format, with Stasis decks accounting for a respectable 3% of the entire meta. Number 27. Staff of the Death Magus. Staff of the Death Magus is an artifact for 3 mana that says, whenever you cast a black spell or a swamp you control enters, you gain 1 life. It was part of a cycle from Magic 2014, a sort of watered-down riff on a bunch of artifacts that first appeared back in Dark Steel. The staff is basically a weaker version of Demon's Horn, which costs 2 mana rather than 3, and gains you life whenever any player casts a black spell, not just you. That didn't stop Staff of the Death Magus from logging 83 competitive appearances in Standard, including winning Grand Prix Chicago 2014. It appeared in Black Devotion decks as a defense against burn. Number 26. Wizard School. Wizard School is a land from Homelands, widely considered one of the weakest sets of all time. It has tap add 1 colorless, as well as pay 1 generic tap, add 1 blue, and pay 2 generic tap, add 1 white or 1 black. This was one of the first lands to explore the concept of mana filtering, though it does it in a terribly inefficient way. Still, in the mid-90s, mana bases had far fewer options than they do today, so cards such as Wizard School sometimes made the cut. Most notably, Michael Leconto's blue-white control deck, which won the very first Pro Tour back in 1996, included a single copy in its mana base. Number 25. Release the Ants. Instant for 1 generic and 1 red, Release the Ants deals 1 damage to any target, clash with an opponent. If you win, return Release the Ants to its owner's hand. To clash, each clashing player reveals the top card of their library, then puts that card on their choice of the top or bottom. A player wins if their card had a greater mana value. The whole clash mechanic underperformed in Constructed, mostly because it's unreliable, and 1 damage for 2 mana is not a great rate. Consequently, Release the Ants posted 0 competitive appearances in Standard and Extended. However, the card found a place in Legacy Omnitel decks. This strategy aims to resolve Show and Tell and put Omniscience directly onto the battlefield. Once Omniscience is in play, every spell in your hand can be cast for free. These decks run many high CMC cards like Emrakul, Atraxa, and Omniscience itself, as well as strong library manipulation such as Brainstorm. The idea is to make sure a high mana value card is on top of your deck, then cast Release the Ants for free, win the clash, and repeat this process infinitely to kill your opponent. Usually these decks run a single copy of Release the Ants in the sideboard, fetching it when needed with things like Burning Wish. On MTG Top 8, close to 800 legacy lists run at least one copy of Release the Ants in their 75. Number 24, March of the Machines. Playing into the block's artifact theme, this enchantment from Mirrodin costs 3 generic and 1 blue and reads, each non-creature artifact is an artifact creature with power and toughness each equal to its mana value. Although that effect is fun and splashy, it doesn't necessarily scream competitive. However, the metagame in 2004 gave it an opening. Mirrodin Standard was overflowing with artifact strategies, and one of the defining features of the format was the presence of the artifact lands. Because those lands had a mana value of 0, resolving March of the Machines immediately turned them into 0/0 creatures, sending them straight to the graveyard. Consequently, in many matchups, the enchantment effectively functioned as a one-sided land destruction spell. That made it an excellent weapon against the dominant affinity decks of the era, which relied heavily on the artifact lands to power out their explosive starts. So rather than using March as a way to attack with animated artifacts, many players simply wanted it because it crippled Affinity's mana base. This strategy made 3rd place at US Nationals in 2004, followed by top 8s at Grand Prix Nagoya and Grand Prix Rimini. Some decks pushed the idea even further. One particularly creative strategy, referred to as Obliterate March, paired the enchantment with the indestructible artifacts Darksteel Ingot and Darksteel Pendant. The deck would then cast Obliterate, destroying every land, creature, and artifact on the battlefield. Thanks to Indestructible, however, the animated Darksteel artifacts survived the devastation, as did March of the Machines itself. After the dust settled, the opponent was left with almost nothing, while the March player still had a battlefield from which to rebuild, or simply chip through with the ingots and pendants themselves. Number 23. Shrine of Piercing Vision. This artifact was part of an uncommon cycle from New Phyrexia. Costing 2 generic, it says, at the beginning of your upkeep, and whenever you cast a blue spell, put a charge counter on this artifact. Shrine of Piercing Vision also has tap, sacrifice this artifact, look at the top X cards of your library, where X is the number of charge counters on this artifact. Put one of those cards into your hand, and the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. On its face, that's not especially exciting, and the setup is kind of awkward. To get meaningful value out of the shrine, you need to play it early and then spend several turns casting blue spells before cashing it in. Draw it later in the game, after you've already cast most of your spells, and it's often far less impressive. No standard decks seemed to want the card. That is, until Splinter Twin came along, which combined the namesake aura with the creature Deceiver Exarch to create infinite tokens. Because the deck relied so heavily on assembling those 2 specific cards, consistency was everything. That's where the shrine came in. Twin lists were already packed with cheap blue cantrips such as Ponder, Preordain, Twisted Image, and the now banned Gitaxian Probe. Casting several inexpensive blue spells caused charge counters to accumulate surprisingly quickly, allowing the shrine to dig pretty deep. This plan took Shrine of Piercing Vision to many top 8s, most notably Grand Prix Pittsburgh 2011. Number 22. Furnace Dragon. Costing 6 generic and 3 red, this rare from Darksteel has flying, affinity for artifacts, and when it enters, if you cast it from your hand, exile all artifacts. That combination of abilities seems a little bizarre. The dragon rewards you for filling your deck with artifacts so you can cast it cheaply, only to immediately remove all of those artifacts once it enters. It's an odd tension. Back in 2004 though, Furnace Dragon found itself in exactly the right environment. As we've already discussed, Mirrodin Block Constructed was dominated by artifact strategies, particularly Affinity, and Furnace Dragon emerged as one of the format's premier answers to those decks. Its most obvious home was Big Red, a strategy built around large red creatures, artifact destruction, and powerful late-game threats. Although the deck wasn't nearly as artifact heavy as Affinity itself, it still played enough cards like Talismans and Great Furnace to reduce the dragon's casting cost significantly. That made the drawback much easier to accept. Losing a handful of your own artifacts was usually a small price to pay when your opponent's battlefield contained far more. Resolving Furnace Dragon often left the Affinity player with virtually nothing. The fact that the dragon exiled artifacts rather than destroying them was another major advantage. Exile prevented death triggers from cards like Disciple of the Vault, eliminating one of Affinity's most dangerous ways of punishing mass artifact removal. As a result, 3 decks playing Furnace Dragon made top 8 at Pro Tour Kobe 2004. Additionally, Affinity players themselves sometimes brought the dragon in from the sideboard for the mirror match. Both players would lose their artifacts, but the dragon's controller would still be left with a 5/5 flying creature ready to dominate an otherwise empty board. Number 21. Debtor's Pulpit. For 4 generic and 1 white, Debtor's Pulpit is an aura that says, Enchanted land has tap target creature. Although the effect itself is useful, the cost of getting it online is enormous, especially since you still have to tap a land to use it. Surprisingly though, this did manage to earn a small competitive niche. During the Return to Ravnica era, some block and standard blue-white control lists ran Debtor's Pulpit in the sideboard. Its purpose was very specific, shutting down that meta's difficult threats such as Aetherling and occasionally Stormbreath Dragon. While cards like Pithing Needle could prevent Aetherling from activating its abilities, Debtor's Pulpit went a step further by locking the creature out of combat. A blue-white control deck with Debtor's Pulpit in the sideboard came 3rd at Grand Prix Chicago 2014 out of more than 2,000 players. Number 20. Feeling of Dread. Innistrad's Feeling of Dread is an instant for 1 generic and 1 white that says, tap up to 2 target creatures. It also has flashback for a cost of 1 generic and 1 blue. Nothing about it is particularly exciting, yet Feeling of Dread managed to notch more than 200 competitive standard appearances, particularly in blue-white Delver and Bant hexproof decks. The card's most notable achievement was appearing in the blue-white Miracles deck that won Pro Tour Avacyn Restored in 2012. In that list, Feeling of Dread helped buy time and worked well with the likes of Thoughtscour and Tamio the Moonsage. By tapping down attackers, the card proved critical in helping pilot Alexander Hayne win his second-to-last match of the tournament against John Finkel, no less. Number 19. Icatian Town. For 5 generic and 1 white, this sorcery creates 4 1/1 citizen creature tokens. That looks very weak now, given that we have far stronger token generators. Even the Jumpstart and Foundation's uncommon Release the Dogs can make 4 1/1 tokens for just 4 mana rather than 6. Still, Ication Town was once regarded as a solid card, especially in metas geared to only remove a small number of creatures. The card's highest level tournament success was making top 8 of Pro Tour New York 1996. Player Eric Tam included it in his Naya aggro deck. Number 18. Thawing Glaciers. This land enters tapped and has pay 1, tap, search your library for a basic land card, put that card onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. Return this land to its owner's hand at the beginning of the next cleanup step. It's a relentless but slow value engine. In the late 90s, however, many decks wanted exactly that, and the card frequently appeared in competitive events. For instance, Thawing Glaciers proved to have tremendous synergy with Zurin Orb, a 0-mana artifact with sacrifice a land, you gain 2 life. Since Glaciers continually replaced the lands you sacrificed, the two cards formed a resilient engine that generated both life and card advantage over the course of a long game. The interaction proved so dominant that both cards were eventually banned in Ice Age Block Constructed because they pushed the format heavily toward control mirrors. Even after those bannings, Thawing Glaciers remained a staple of standard control decks, appearing in top 8 lists at both Worlds 1996 and Worlds 1997. Then, an unexpected rules update gave the card a second wind in Extended in 1999. When 6th edition introduced the modern turn structure that year, the end of a turn was split into distinct steps, including a new cleanup step after the end step. Before that change, end of turn abilities all happened together during a single end of turn sequence. That rules revision created an unintended interaction. Originally, Thawing Glaciers simply returned to its owner's hand at end of turn after being activated. Under the new structure, however, players could wait until the cleanup step to activate it. Because the return trigger had already passed for that turn, the land would remain on the battlefield until the following cleanup step, allowing it to be activated again during the next turn before finally bouncing. So, instead of searching for 1 basic land every turn cycle, the card could now find 2 before returning to your hand, making an already solid resource engine dramatically stronger. That year, decks playing Thawing Glaciers made top 8 at Pro Tour Chicago and Worlds. The loophole eventually became too much to ignore. Wizards updated the card's wording so that it specifically returns to its owner's hand during the cleanup step itself, preventing the rules exploit. Number 17. Harvest Worm. 1 generic and 1 green for a 3/2. When it enters, sacrifice it unless you return a basic land card from your graveyard to your hand. Those stats were pushed for the Weatherlight era, though requiring a basic in your graveyard is a lot of setup. Still, the deck that came third at Worlds 1997 ran 3 copies of Harvest Worm. It was a mono-green stompy deck built around hyper-aggro creatures and pump spells. One of its signature cards was Rogue Elephant, a 1-mana 3/3 that demands you sacrifice a forest when it enters the battlefield. Although sacrificing lands would normally slow a deck down, this strategy barely cared. Its curve was exceptionally low, and mana dorks like Llanowar Elves helped compensate for the temporary loss of mana. The list also ran Heart of Yavimaya, a land that could boost your creatures but likewise required sacrificing a forest. These cards helped enable the worm, almost turning its drawback into an upside. Number 16. Myr Incubator. This artifact from Mirrodin costs 6 mana and has pay 6, tap, sacrifice this artifact, search your library for any number of artifact cards, exile them, then create that many 1/1 colorless Myr artifact creature tokens, then shuffle. That effect can produce an absurd number of tokens at the pretty sizable cost of 12 mana and dramatically thinning your deck. It also requires you to build around it, stocking your list with artifacts. Still, some intrepid deck builders found ways to make this card work. For instance, at Pro Tour New Orleans in 2003, Eugene Harvey made top 8 out of more than 300 players with an extended Tinker deck using the Incubator as one of its win cons. Metalworker also helped you to get the mana needed to crack it. A year later, player Manuel Bevand came third at Worlds 2004 with a Croc Clan Ironworks standard deck that ran a full playset of Mer Incubator. The list played a full 42 artifacts, and its plan was to sack them to KCI, generating a ton of colorless mana and powering out a massive Mer Incubator activation. The deck could then also win by sacrificing these tokens to the Ironworks for even more mana, and finishing the opponent off with a fireball. Number 15. Provax the Cursed. 2 generic and double black for a legendary vampire that enters with 4+1/+1 counters on it. Provax also says, at the beginning of your upkeep, you may sacrifice a creature. If you do, put a +1/+1 counter on Provax. If you don't, remove a +1/+1 counter from Provax. Finally, you can pay 1 black to give him flying until end of turn. While he's certainly no Edgar Markov, Provax was a legitimate tournament threat during the Stronghold era, able to fly over blockers and smack for a solid 4 damage a turn. He appeared in the deck that won Worlds 1998. It was a strategy dubbed Suicide Black, an aggro list running creatures like Carnophage and Doubt the Slayer, alongside effects like Dark Ritual and Culling the Weak for mana acceleration. Number 14. Magnivore, the red entry in Odyssey's Lurgoyf cycle. Magnivore costs 2 generic and 2 red, has haste, and says, Magnivore's power and toughness are each equal to the number of sorcery cards in all graveyards. For comparison, the Amonkhet Uncommon Enigma Drake costs 1 generic, 1 blue, and 1 red, has flying, and its power is equal to the number of sorceries in your graveyard plus the number of instants, not just sorceries alone. Most decks simply don't fill their graveyards with enough sorceries for Magnivore to become a serious threat, and because it lacks any form of evasion, even a large one can be stalled by an expendable chump blocker. Nevertheless, when Magnivore first entered Standard in 2002, it found itself in exactly the kind of environment that it wanted, since several competitive decks naturally loaded their graveyards with sorceries. One obvious home was Red Burn, which was packed with sorceries like Volcanic Hammer and Firebolt. Magnivore saw play again after it was reprinted in 9th edition in 2005. This time around, the Lurgoyf was deployed in land destruction strategies. These decks spent the early turns repeatedly attacking opposing mana with sorceries such as Stone Rain and Eye of Nowhere, aimed at casting a back-breaking Wildfire in the late game, and then sought to beat their opponent down with a beefy Magnivore to wrap things up. It also became a popular finisher in blue-red control decks, which spent the early game casting numerous sorceries before eventually turning all of that graveyard fuel into a single oversized threat. Even these days, a few niche Oath of Druids combo decks run Magnivore in pre-modern. In these builds, Magnivore is their only creature, so they're guaranteed to get it, and Oath of Druids mills cards in the process, thus growing the Magnivore. Number 13. Storm Shaman. First printed in Alliances, Storm Shaman is a 0/4 for 2 generic and 1 red, with pay 1 red, this creature gets +1/+0 until end of turn. Those are flimsy baseline stats, and the fire breathing demands an enormous mana investment turn after turn to be impactful. Circa 1996, This was still strong enough to earn Storm Shaman a spot in several red-green aggro decks, including those that claimed 5th place at Worlds and 1st place at Pro Tour Columbus. Number 12. Manipulate Fate. Sorcery for 1 generic and 1 blue. Search your library for 3 cards, exile them, then shuffle. Draw a card. When this card debuted in Invasion in 2000, there were not many good ways of taking advantage of it. Manipulate Fate would have to wait a full 13 years for its time to shine. The printing of Mist Hollow Griffin in Avacyn Restored enabled a combo with the enchantment Food Chain. Food Chain has exile a creature you control, add X mana of any one color, where X is 1 plus the exiled creature's mana value. Spend this mana only to cast creature spells. The Griffin can be cast from exile, so you repeatedly exile and recast it, netting 1 mana each time for infinite mana. Manipulate Fate is a cheap way of getting the Griffin into exile, while also digging toward other pieces. As recently as last year, Manipulate Fate appeared in a food chain list that 5-0'd an MTGO Legacy League. Number 11. Fountain of Youth. 2 copies of this artifact appeared in the blue-white control deck that won Pro Tour New York 1996. It costs 0 mana and has pay 2, tap, you gain 1 life. 2 other top 8 decks at that tournament included it in their sideboards. 2 mana for 1 life, capped at 1 activation per turn cycle, is underwhelming in any era, yet some of these players clearly felt Fountain of Youth was a good enough hedge against the meta's aggro decks. Number 10. Dwarven Trader. At the Atlanta Pro Tour qualifier in 1996, player Paul Sly made Magic history by pioneering the mono-red aggro strategy that would come to bear his name. It finished as the runner-up at the event, despite containing some remarkably weak cards by modern standards. Among them was Dwarven Trader, a vanilla 1/1 for 1 red. Even at the time it was awful, but Sly just needed cheap creatures to fill out his curve, and it worked. Number 9. Goblins of the Flog. This brings us to another terrible card from the original Sly deck. It's also 1 red for a 1/1, but it has Mountain Walk, and when you control a dwarf, sacrifice this creature, making it a total non-bow with Dwarven Trader. It's pretty hilarious that these 2 cards shared space in the same deck list. Number 8. Hallowed Ground. This enchantment costs 1 generic and 1 white, and has pay 2 white, return target non-snow land you control to its owner's hand. That's an almost laughably narrow effect, but it still cropped up in successful standard decks. For example, it was used in the blue-white control deck that won Pro Tour New York 1996, as well as in the sideboard of the mono-white control deck that came second at Pro Tour Dallas. The blue-white deck used it in conjunction with Ivory Tower, a 1 mana artifact that says, at the beginning of your upkeep, you gain X life, where X is the number of cards in your hand minus 4. Hallowed Ground lets you bounce lands back to hand to make sure you consistently gained life. Number 7. Knight of the Mists. Knight of the Mists is a 2/2 human knight for 2 generic and 1 blue. It has flanking, and when this creature enters, you may pay 1 blue mana. If you don't, destroy target knight and it can't be regenerated. That's meant as a downside. Knight of the Mists will usually be the only knight on the board, forcing you to pay an extra blue to keep it alive. However, the crucial text here is target knight, meaning that you can destroy another knight provided one is in play. This gave Knight of the Mists a cool competitive niche. In that standard meta, Black Knight was a very popular card, so some blue decks used Knight of the Mists as a weapon to take out opposing knights. The blue-red control deck that won Worlds 1997 ran a full playset of the card in its sideboard. Number 6. Ticking Gnomes. Urza's Legacy was full of broken cards, but Ticking Gnomes was not one of them. It's a 3/3 for 3 with Echo, meaning you have to pay its mana cost again on your next upkeep or sacrifice it. It also has sacrifice this creature, it deals 1 damage to any target. Still, having 3 toughness meant the gnomes could reliably block the 2x creatures that were common back then, and in a pinch you could use it as a removal spell to ping a troublesome X1. In the top 8 of Worlds 1999, 3 mono-black decks were playing Ticking Gnomes. Number 5. Rupture Spire. Released in the multicolor themed Alara block, Rupture Spire is a land that can tap for 1 mana of any color. However, that flexibility is balanced out by 2 significant downsides. Rupture Spire enters tapped and says, when it enters, sacrifice it unless you pay 1. So the turn you play it, it effectively sets you back 2 mana, since you have to pay 1 to keep it, and you can't tap it either. Still, player Kazuya Mitamura felt Rupture Spire's slowness was justified in his 4-color midrange block constructed deck. It was very mana greedy, running powerhouse cards like Bloodbraid Elf, Ajani Vengeant, and Putrid Leech. He took it to a top 8 finish at Pro Tour Honolulu 2009. Number 4. Woolly Spider. 1 generic and double green for a 2/3 with reach, and whenever this creature blocks a creature with flying, it gets +0/+2 until end of turn. Woolly Spider's claim to fame was its appearance in the red-green aggro deck that player Ole Rade took to Pro Tour Columbus 1996, widely considered one of the weakest decks to ever win a Pro Tour. That meta was full of control decks, so instead of joining them, Rade attacked the format from the opposite direction with an aggressive strategy designed to punish slow starts. His creatures were individually unimpressive, but many of them, like the spider, deliberately had toughness 3 or greater, so they could survive Pyroclasm, a common sweeper at the time. Other staples of the era, including Surrendered Efreet and Sengir Vampire, also found themselves stalled by the spider more often than not. Against many of the game's best flying creatures at the time, it served as a respectable defensive answer. In other words, rather than building the objectively strongest deck, Rade built the one best positioned for the tournament he expected to face. His Pro Tour win remains a reminder that success in Magic often comes not from playing the most powerful cards, but from bringing the right strategy for the field in front of you. Number 3. Stormbind. This is another card that famously showed up in Rade's red-green deck. It's an enchantment from Ice Age for 1 generic, 1 red, and 1 green. It has pay 2, discard a card at random. This enchantment deals 2 damage to any target. The main problem here is that the discard is random. As long as your hand contains cards you actually need, activating Stormbind is a gamble. Losing the wrong spell, land, or answer at the wrong moment can easily cost you the game. Even before its use in the Woolly Spider deck, some control players included Stormbind alongside the likes of Ivory Tower and Meekstone. The former generated respectable amounts of life, even though it's a bit of a non-bo with Stormbind in other ways, while the latter kept larger creatures permanently tied down. Stormbind complemented that strategy. It could pick off the smaller creatures that slipped past Meekstone's restriction, and once the battlefield was under control, it gradually transformed into a win condition by repeatedly hurling damage at your opponent's face. All told, Stormbind appeared in 1 top 8 deck at Worlds 1995, 2 top 8 decks at Pro Tour New York 1996, and 1 at Worlds 1996. Following its reprint on Time Spiral's time-shifted sheet in 2006, Stormbind again achieved a small amount of success, appearing in top 8 block constructed decks at Pro Tour Yokohama 2007 and Grand Prix San Francisco 2007. In that meta, the card had some synergy with the Madness Burn Spell Fiery Temper. Number 2. Giant Mantis, a card that looks like pure draft chaff. Giant Mantis is 3 generic and 1 green for a 2/4 with reach. That's it. Pro player and later Wizards employee Mike Turian included this card in his green-white Mirage block constructed deck at Grand Prix Toronto 1997, piloting the list to a top 8 finish. The Mantis's 4 points of toughness made it hard to kill with burn spells, and the reach meant it could block popular flyers of the day like Waterspout Djinn, Cloud Elemental, and Frenetic Efreet. Number 1. Sleight of Mind. This one is a little different from the others, and it has a story behind it. At Worlds 1996, player Tom Chanfeng captured the title with a white weenie deck featuring some weird cards. Most notably, it had 1 copy of Sleight of Mind in the main board and another in the sideboard. It's an instant for 1 blue, reading, change the text of target spell or permanent by replacing all instances of 1 color word with another. However, Chanfeng was running absolutely 0 blue sources in his 75, so he had no way of ever casting Sleight of Mind. So not only is Sleight of Mind a weak card in absolute terms, but in this particular list it was literally a dead draw. So how did this happen? It all comes down to a deck registration mistake. Chanfeng had intended to play 4 copies of Adakar Wastes, but he accidentally left them off the deck list he submitted. Under the tournament rules of the era, an incomplete deck list wasn't corrected by restoring the missing cards. Instead, players were required to replace the omissions with basic lands until the deck contained the required 60 cards. That ruling left Chanfeng in an awkward position. His deck relied heavily on white mana, featuring 12 2-mana creatures with double white casting costs, while also including several colorless mana sources like Strip Mine and Mishra's Factory. Adding islands would have made the mana base far less reliable, so he opted to fill the empty slots with 4 planes instead. Yet, even with that handicap, Chanfeng cruised to first place. That's all for today. Until next time, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and consider joining my Patreon or becoming a member on YouTube. Also, remember that you can follow the link in the description to get 5% off your Magic purchases from Card Trader Zero.